Good morning and welcome to the webinar on navigating COVID-19 scenarios for Chile. My name is Matthew Riley and I'm the Client Services Manager at Ducker Frontier based in Washington, D.C. Before we get started, I realize that some of you may potentially be new to Ducker Frontier, so I thought I would take a brief 2 minutes to provide you with a very quick overview of our firm and how we work with executives at major multinationals. Ducker Frontier is a market intelligence and consulting firm. We provide tailored solutions to drive growth for clients across B2B, healthcare, consumer, and technology sectors. Our dedicated teams serve as advisors to clients, delivering the market and industry knowledge they need to succeed at all points of the business cycle. Our continuous research and insights, custom solutions, as well as transaction support services provide clients with timely, actionable insights to adapt and win in changing markets. Ducker Frontier is headquartered in Washington, D.C., with offices in Troy, Michigan, New York, London, Paris, Berlin, Singapore, Shanghai, and Bangalore across the globe. For more information, please visit www.duckerfrontier.com. So with that very brief overview, it's now my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Alex Schober. Alex is our Senior Analyst for Latin America Research and covers Argentina, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay for Ducker Frontier.
Thank you, Matt. Good morning, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Now let's get started. So to touch on structure for our teleconference, it will consist of a 45-minute moderated discussion followed by a Q&A session. So if you have any questions or points of clarification regarding any of the topics that we covered today, please send them to us via Ducker Frontier webinars. I will surely do my best to ensure that they are addressed during the Q&A period. So Alex, thanks again for your time with us today. Take it away.
Thank you, Matt. So first and foremost, allow me to say that I hope everyone on the line and your families are safe and healthy, and our hearts go out to you if that is unfortunately not the case. Certainly, it's been tough to separate the personal from the professional this year, and to that end, I'll do my best to add a little bit of empathy while providing you all with the reality of Chile's outlook and what that means for your business. So with that being said, let me start off by explaining the polling system. So up until this point, there may be a few of you on the line who have not attended any of our live events or any of our webinars, and we do like to keep these somewhat interactive. And to that end, if you wouldn't mind typing the following email address into your Chrome engine or Safari or whatever phone that you're using, pollev.com/dfrontier560. It'll prompt you to ask what industry you belong to, and you can put in B2C, industrials, IT, healthcare, other company, no company, and then just click on next, and that would give us a great idea of what kind of representation that we have on today's phone call. It'll also help us potentially separate polling answers by industry, which would obviously help you depending on what industry you belong to. So just to kind of warm up and to kind of go off the previous thing I was just saying about industries and being able to kind of separate who's joining today, first question I wanted to ask everyone is what industry best reflects your company's activities. Again, if you could type in your industry as kind of your name, if you don't want to put your own name, and then answer which industry you belong to get things started, that would be immensely helpful for us. And of course, if you're here just to learn about Chile and you don't represent any company, or if you don't belong to any of these industries, you can always select individual participant. There's no reason why you couldn't be able to join in it either. Cool, so it looks like we're getting a good bit of representation, a solid healthcare representation, which is not surprising since a lot of our clients are healthcare clients. But great, I'm gonna go ahead and go to the next question, which is which is one of the more first informative questions that we have. By how much do you estimate COVID-19 will impact your revenues this year in Chile? Please select one, and you can see that the choices range from revenue falling short by original target from 0 to 5%, up to more than 20%. We even have a few options of surpassing your original target towards the end of the spectrum here. And of course, options H and option I are no impact on top line revenue expected or other. Great. Give everyone a few more minutes here. One thing I've started to notice after doing these questions a few times now, having done the Argentina and the Peru webinar myself, is that it seems like the answers are getting a little bit more skewed to the negative each week we do this, which kind of makes sense given the fact that lockdowns are lasting longer than expected. The pandemic's taking longer than we would expect to kind of proliferate. So it's not really very surprising here that I see 42% of y'all saying that you expect revenue to fall short of your original target by more than 20%. Good.
Sure, Alex.
So I'm going to go ahead.
How do these compare to some?
I'm sorry, Matt, what was that?
Continue. You're good.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the meat of the presentation. Thank you all for answering in that poll question. I wanted to start things off with some key takeaways. I think this is a great slide to show to any of your colleagues who maybe not be able to attend, or if you just wanted to kind of present to anyone outside of your business about what you learned today. I think that's immensely helpful as well. So the first key takeaway that we have, and this was one of the subjects of the email that we sent out advertising this webinar, is that Chile's early successes at containing COVID-19 are unfortunately now proving ineffective. And there are a lot of reasons behind that. I'm going to spend a lot of the first part of the presentation talking about this. But part of the reason why is because Chile was one of the countries that never did a national lockdown, which obviously didn't really help contain the virus from a mobility standpoint. And then you also had a delayed spread in some of the poorer areas of the country, which has both resulted in a pretty late surge in cases and deaths and a pretty accelerating and worrisome trend in Chile. The second thing is that the large economic stimulus package that the government has already announced and implemented is still going to be insufficient as it pertains to containing job losses and preventing worse healthcare outcomes. The thing is, once the pandemic gets worse, there's going to be more and more money needed to help the economy. And even though Chile's fiscal stimulus package has been close to 12% of GDP, it's not going to be enough to avoid a deep recession this year. In the 2021 rebound is going to be mostly statistical, as has been the case in all the other markets in Latin America that we cover. Third, we do expect social unrest to return after the pandemic in all likelihood. Chile had protests at the end of 2019, and that kind of seems like it was a year ago, even though it was not. A lot of the key demands during that time were unaddressed, and the COVID-19 fallout, we believe, will unfortunately exacerbate the social angst. Fourth, as far as external factors, these are extremely important for Chile's economy, as you all know, copper in particular. And even though copper exports have stayed somewhat resilient, at least compared to other major copper exporters throughout the world, there is likely a low ceiling of what that can mean. In other words, we don't expect an export-led miracle, mostly due to negative global outlook and the fact that other suppliers such as Peru are coming back online, which is going to mean that copper prices are going to probably have a ceiling. Finally, we do expect 2 to 3 years to return to sustainable growth. This is actually still one of the more faster recovery paths of the Latin American markets that we cover, even though we still do expect this to be a pretty lengthy and cumbersome process for the economy. But of course, companies are going to find opportunities in the meantime. So I'm going to start this first part of the presentation talking about understanding how we're analyzing COVID-19 from an economic lens and from analyzing really how Chile stands compared to other Latin American countries with regards to how it's handling the COVID-19 crisis. It's obviously on everyone's minds, and we're taking a slightly different approach to analyzing this terrible disease, again, from an economic and business lens. And here are the 4 factors that we believe are common to all countries and not just Chile. The first one's the reoccurrence, length, and stringency of social distancing measures. We do believe that it's very likely that there are going to be at least some isolated second waves at the very least, and it's going to be extremely important for governments to be able to react to that. And even up until that point, the length of social distancing measures, which we're now seeing are becoming a problem in Chile with how long the quarantine for Santiago has been going on, that's going to have an economic impact as well. Secondly, government stimulus during and after the social distancing measures. So it's one thing to announce this big fiscal stimulus package now, but I will say it's important to note that and remember that a lot of Chile's third fiscal stimulus package, which I'll talk about in a minute, is aimed for next year. And that's extremely important to help employment start a sustainable recovery towards the end of this year and going into next year is government stimulus throughout this entire period to get the economy back on the rails. Third, I think this is probably the most important thing for the long term, and that's the timing of treatment and vaccine. Simply put, there's just not going to be people who are going to have the same levels of confidence that they had before COVID-19 until they know that they're safe, and that safety comes in the form of a really effective treatment or a vaccine. And then fourth, political and social stability. This is going to be really important for Chile, and I'm going to talk about this in great length in the next section of the presentation. But certainly, COVID-19, how governments manage the crisis and the fallout is going to have major political and social ramifications after the fact. So here I wanted to mention the analysis that we've been alluding to frequently up until this point, called The Hammer and the Dance by Tomás Puello. I keep saying this every time I present, but if you haven't read the analysis, I highly recommend it, even though it is probably 2 or 3 months, a little bit outdated at this point. But it doesn't really change the fact that the analysis that he presents is extremely relevant for every economy and government in the world in containing the virus. And the first part of that process is the hammer. This is the process that most countries in Latin America, or I should say all countries in Latin America, are currently in the middle of. Basically, this helps governments create time. It helps them flatten the curve of virus contagions to not overwhelm healthcare infrastructure. That's great. That's what all governments are mostly doing right now. But soon they're going to enter this dancing phase. And no one's really in this phase yet. You could probably argue that Western Europe and parts of the United States are now entering the dancing phase. So that's what that's going to look like, more or less. And what we've learned is that reopening is not really a matter of just going back to normal. It's gradual, it's planned. And on top of that, there's also risk of further outbreaks, as I said already. And this means we have to, dance. It means that we have to be able to gradually reopen economies, but also swiftly isolate pockets of new coronavirus cases when they inevitably come. Obviously, not every government is going to be as successful at this as others. And to that end, we have what we call the bachata, which is a slower dance or a less effective dance. Maybe you have larger outbreaks or less effective measures of swiftly containing secondary outbreaks. And then we have the samba, which we would say is the more preferred of these two dances, which is more effective. In other words, the faster dance of these two. This slide, which has a lot of text, I'm not going to read all of it, but really these are some of the characteristics that differentiate good dancing skills, if you want to say that, versus not so great ones. These all matter during the hammer phase as well, but there are some that are extremely important for governments to get right in this next phase. First is early reaction. This is something that's going to be key for Chile opening at the right pace. It means if there is a secondary outbreak that's pretty massive, you need to implement social distancing measures and make sure to pinpoint them extraordinarily well. And how big these social distancing measures are in terms of scale comes down to the second factor, which is good information. This is basically the more information of who has the virus, who might have the virus, who has had the virus. And the more targeted social distancing can be, that would also relate to less economic damage and being able to reopen at a faster pace after that. Third, healthcare infrastructure. This comes down to more beds, more ICUs. The more of those two things that you have, the better. Part of the intention, as I mentioned, of the hammer phase was to buy time for governments and healthcare systems so they wouldn't be overwhelmed later. And then lastly, endorsement for local authorities. And this is really alignment with healthcare experts, multilateral organizations such as the WHO and local authorities. The more aligned that you have leaders, the more likely it is that people will actually follow the rules. So, for example, if you open restaurants too quickly after the confirmation of one leader, but maybe not a healthcare expert, people might stay home. And this creates a pretty fragmented reopening process that is inconsistent. So with regards to everything that I've said up until this point, you can see that Chile was relatively successful at containing the virus, at least initially. However, over the last month and a half, we've seen a pretty massive outbreak. And we can see in this chart that only Peru and Brazil have experienced more COVID-19 deaths per million in Chile. And this reality, as well as some of the factors I'm going to describe in the next few pages, really make us believe that Chile will be slightly less effective reopening its economy and dealing with potential second waves. So in other words, likely dancing the bachata as opposed to the samba. And this is something that we take into account when we talk about Chile scenarios. So over the next couple of pages, I'm going to kind of at least explain why I think that this has been the case. Why has Chile been hit harder, at least in terms of those statistics, compared to other countries in Latin America and other countries throughout the world? Excuse me. You can see here that part of what this the explanatory factor here is higher testing. I'm not going to sit here and say that higher testing is the only reason why Chile has become one of the global hotspots for COVID-19. But one metaphor that I read recently that I liked, and something I think is very relevant to Chile, is that countries with low testing are really only showing the tip of the iceberg of the problem of contagions in the country. Meanwhile, countries with more testing, such as Chile, Peru, and other countries to the right of Chile and Peru here, such as Germany and other countries in Western Europe, those countries are showing the tip of the iceberg and a few feet down. So there's transparency, and with transparency comes worse looking data when it comes to a pandemic. So I do think this only partially explains the phenomenon. You can see that Western Europe and the US test a lot more than Chile. Meanwhile, Chile is becoming one of the global hotspots of COVID-19. So that means another and probably more valid explanation is the fact that Chile never entered a full lockdown, as you can see circled in the orange towards the bottom right-hand corner of this chart. In other words, their hammer phase hasn't really been a true hammer compared to Argentina, Colombia, and Peru, which all did go under full lockdowns. Originally, Chile chose to implement a dynamic style of quarantine, which sometimes pinpoints lockdowns down to specific street corners. But that approach was, applauded initially by the international media, but it became clear it didn't stop circulation completely, and the virus eventually spread to more densely populated areas of the country, many of which are characterized by precarious living situations. That's the reality that exists in Chile and a lot of Latin America today. I'm going to talk a lot more about this dynamic going forward. So, based on what I said, you may imagine that mobility might have been through the roof, but that really hasn't been the case with Chile. Actually, outside of Argentina, Chile's mobility has been extremely limited, at least as it pertains to walking. And this is, extremely notable given the fact that Chile, again, never actually implemented a full lockdown. A more granular mobility data analysis, which I did do while making this presentation, did kind of suggest that food visits and medicine and pharmacies and stuff like that did stay somewhat elevated in Santiago. But I think that's pretty universal across big cities throughout the world. I think what really sets Santiago, if we're going to zero in on Santiago for a minute, apart from, in my opinion, is that circulation was never particularly restricted until just recently. I actually watched a news reporting in international media outlets in which the lady who was corresponding said that their team drove all the way through Santiago during the quarantine like 2 weeks ago, wasn't stopped once by the police, didn't see anyone being stopped by the police, and there were people walking around waiting for public transportation, what have you. I think that's pretty problematic. So on one hand, there wasn't a lot of accountability. On the other hand, workers who do live paycheck to paycheck didn't feel particularly obliged to stay at home and went out to work. And I will say that, at least based on what I've read, the Santiago Metro is still running relatively efficiently. Santiago is a big bus network, so a lot of people may not actually have to do a lot of walking in Santiago to get from point A to point B. So, overall, especially in late March and early April, before the government became more strict on the city of Santiago, the circulation began, and it became a little bit too rapid to stop. Finally, I think this is a good transition point to what I wanted to make about inequality and why COVID-19 has hit Chile hard, and that's really coming down to inequality of resources. And the often reported anecdotes of richer Latin Americans contracting the virus abroad and bringing it back home, and spreading it throughout the country. Obviously that may not be the point by point story of what really happened, but there are some elements of the truth here as it pertains to how this played out in Chile. Because originally the virus was pretty isolated to the eastern communes of Santiago, such as Las Condes, Providencia, Vitacura, a lot of the wealthier neighborhoods of the city, but it's now spread exponentially to the communes with the least amount of resources, as you can see. The bubble sizes here basically is budgets executed per inhabitant in each of these Santiago communes. And you can see that the communes with the least amount of resources towards the upper right-hand corner of this graph have been hit by COVID-19 a little bit harder. This has obviously had an impact on straining the healthcare infrastructure of the country, especially Santiago, in which we see 98% of hospitals are nearly close to their ICU occupancy capacity. And I think it's clear that Chile really did have and does have a good healthcare infrastructure. Don't get me wrong, but I think very few healthcare infrastructures in the world can absorb the kind of exponential growth that Chile experienced. Moreover, the gap between private and public healthcare in Chile is extraordinarily large, which is something that's not necessarily captured on this page, meaning that public health hospitals have lacked the resources to save COVID-19 patients, maybe at the same success rate as private institutions. In fact, there was a study from CIPER, the local investigative media outlets in Chile that came out a few days ago that suggested that the mortality rates at public hospitals was substantially higher, sometimes up to 5 times higher than private institutes and private clinics in hospitals in Santiago. Obviously, that's problematic. It's causing the healthcare infrastructure to be strained, and it's resulting in a kind of a self-fulfilling feedback loop in which the pandemic is getting worse and worse. So that was a lot of negatives. Let's talk a little bit about a silver lining really quick, and that is Chile really does have the capacity to ramp up public spending and to help spend enough to mitigate this economic crisis and to keep the real economy more or less on the path to recovery. You can see that Chile, at least if we're comparing how it compares to other countries in Latin America with its sovereign debt ratings, you can see that Chile is pretty well positioned. And you can see that in this next page, that their fiscal and monetary stimulus packages up until this point have been pretty impressive. It's been about $29 billion over this year and next, about 11.6% of GDP. That's pretty massive compared to other stimulus packages that we've seen in emerging and frontier markets. And you can see that a lot of the spending has been put forth into government-backed credits to SMEs, and more recently, slightly larger companies. We've also seen cash payouts to informal workers, emergency family income initiatives, compensation for those who can't work from home, etc. And probably the last fiscal stimulus package that happened, which was announced about a week and a half ago, is probably the most comprehensive up until now, in my view, and actually spreading the resources out a little bit more. But there's probably more that the Chilean government can still do, at least as it pertains to trying to shelter the most vulnerable and to keep the economy up and running. And this is going to become an issue when it comes to help saving jobs, because the robust stimulus package that we've seen up until this point is not going to be enough to halt layoffs completely, certainly. You can see in this chart that even just in the rolling quarter of February to April, we saw about 706,000 jobs lost, which is an 8% decline from the previous quarter. It only implies an unemployment rate of 9%, but given the fact that this rolling quarter encapsulated February and March, and half of March obviously was not under quarantine or really under a huge threat from the coronavirus in Latin America, the next 2 quarters should be significantly worse, and we're probably going to see the unemployment rate closer to around 15% during the next couple of rolling quarters in Chile. Obviously, the size of the fiscal stimulus package and what the government does is going to have a big impact on trying to mitigate these losses going forward, but we should expect a much bigger drop in the next couple of quarters. This is going to vary by industry. I should say employment destruction is going to vary by industry. If you saw my presentation on Peru, I showed the exact same slide where it's basically a sensitivity model of impact on restrictions in the x-axis and the size of employment as a percentage of the total on the y-axis, which shows that, as you can imagine, the wholesale and retail industry has been hit really hard, and it's probably going to be one of the last sectors to completely recover the employment that it had before COVID-19. And you could probably see this from a more macro lens as well, as these are probably going to be the more and less resilient industries as far as it pertains to timing of recovery after the economy does begin to reopen. Lastly, the so what of this, the labor market's deterioration is going to be fall in real wages. You can see in this graph that we had the first fall in real wages in almost 10 years in Chile. This is going to take a toll on discretionary income and have a negative impact on overall consumer spending. We should probably expect that wages are going to continue contracting over the next couple of months, which is obviously not great for the pace of recovery of consumer spending, but it's just the reality that Chile is in right now. So the third variable that we're using for this analytical framework, as I mentioned, super important, is the timing and the treatment and the vaccine. This is probably going to start playing a role in 2021, not so much this year, even though we continue to see somewhat positive news come out from the rumor mill about this. As many of you know, the fastest vaccine ever created was Ebola in about 5 years, but that record's certainly to be broken with COVID-19. And really our for this is that we're going to have moderate access to Latin America by Q4 2021. Of course, this is important because it's one thing to develop the vaccine, which according to this calendar would probably be sometime at the beginning of 2021. It's another thing to develop it and distribute it to other countries throughout the world. So to that end, we do expect that would occur by Q4. And moderate access, we basically define as 25% of the population or 50% of the population if you want to consider it to be good access. This is something that is included in our scenarios as it pertains to growth starting in Q4 2021. So lastly, the final analytical variable that we're leveraging is political social consequences. I'm going to spend 10 minutes or so in the next section talking about what this means for Chile, so I won't get into the nitty-gritty here. But the clear trend across the region is that presidents who have prioritized healthcare over the economy have enjoyed pretty substantial boosts to their approval ratings. The main ones being Fernandez, Iván Duque, and Martín Vizcarra of Peru. I'm not saying Piñera didn't prioritize healthcare, but he was already in a weak position following the protests last year, and his government strategy so far has been relatively piecemeal, which hasn't boded well for his approval ratings, which has stayed around 25% for the last several weeks that CADEM publishes their public opinion polls. So putting these two economic variables together, you can see that Chile is in a decent enough position to handle a crisis from an economic lens. As you can see, that's the y-axis on here, which is a strong but insufficient government economic response. But as far as the virus is concerned, we do think that they are more likely than not going to dance the bachata and have a slightly less effective reopening and secondary outbreak management approach compared to maybe Argentina and Colombia, which have done a pretty good job in keeping the number of cases down in their respective countries, but certainly better than probably Peru, Brazil, and Mexico. And this page basically shows what these scenarios look like from a probabilistic standpoint, just focused on Chile. And you can see that we expect there's about a 45% likelihood that Chile will dance the bachata, and about a 20% chance that there's large secondary outbreaks. And the more positive would be the samba at around 30%. And you can see that our most likely scenario for COVID-19 is going to be the narrow U in the top right-hand corner with the bachata and the strong but insufficient economic stimulus package. So great.
Yeah, that was a good overview of COVID-19, Alex. You presented some pretty harrowing figures during that section. When do you think things will get better?
So good question, and we'll talk about timing later, but I do think that we are in the very worst of the health and economic crisis right now. And, something that I struggled with making this deck and analyzing Chile and other countries in Latin America in general was trying to pick apart the silver linings. But I'm an eternal optimist, and I do believe in the international community to find a treatment by the end of the year and a vaccine early next year. And again, in the case of Chile, as I was mentioning about the economy, I do think the economic resources that the government and the central bank are throwing at the crisis will help mitigate things and help put the economy back on track faster than a lot of other countries in the region.
Great. Yeah, I hope so too, Alex. So why don't we move on to the next section about Chile's unique challenges?
Great. Thanks, Matt. So as I've alluded to a few times, Chile's economy entered a pretty sharp contraction in Q4 of last year amid the social unrest. There was a pretty mild recovery in Q1, allowing the country to avoid a technical recession. This was mostly just based on the fact that a lot of the social uncertainty was kept to a minimum while people were on vacation and were out of school and what have you. But we shouldn't expect this slightly positive momentum to last in the national accounts data. In fact, this year is probably going to be the worst recession since the 1980s for Chile, when they had a crisis back at the beginning of that decade. So, assuming that the coronavirus does inflict pretty big short-term damage on Chile's economy, we should also look beyond just COVID-19 as it pertains to the country's outlook. And here are the two factors that are going to be important to monitor during the short to medium term outlook for Chile. One being social and political dynamics leading up to and including the 2021 general election. Sometimes easy to forget that there's an election in Chile at the end of next year, but it's incredibly important nevertheless. And then two, mineral prices, particularly copper. This is, obviously incredibly important, as more than 50% of Chile's exports are copper. So that's always going to be something that's very important to monitor in Chile as time goes along. So starting with political dynamics, let's set the stage by describing some of the root causes of the protests last year. I could spend the next hour talking about this, but the long story short is that income inequality and inequality of access to quality public services were two of the key causes of the social unrest, which began in October. And you can see the inequality aspect playing out on the graph on the left, which shows that Chile is wealthier per capita than other Latin American countries, but is also more unequal. Comparing Chile to other Western Europe and OECD countries that I would like to associate with, it seems like it's a long way off. And the reality of the situation is that for a lot of Chile's lower and middle income classes, this is even more unattainable. And the general anxiety really manifests itself in demands for greater income equality, higher pension payouts, better quality public education and healthcare, and more accountability from politicians and security forces. I can say, pretty straightforward that, a lot of these demands on the right have not been addressed. We still haven't had the pension reform. Income inequality is something that takes a long time to address through many, many reforms and many, many changes in policy. And really, I think that a lot of these social tensions really have not dissipated at all during the COVID-19 pandemic. And honestly, if anything, I think that the government's mixed messages up until this point have potentially exacerbated social angst. I mentioned this in the last section that Chile managed the pandemic pretty well at first. You can see that there was a time back in April where the government was lauding these world's first COVID-19 immunity cards, and that was quickly criticized and scrapped. And there was a lot of positive press about Chile at that point, about dynamic quarantines and what have you. And all of a sudden, you had the amount of cases start to really pick up, and you had the healthcare minister step down. And you also had a pretty notorious event that happened this past weekend where the Ministry of Health basically announced 3,000 new coronavirus-related deaths that were not part of the official statistics, which nearly doubled the amount of official statistics, which kind of made people think that, is the government really telling us everything that we need to know about what's going on here? So that is certainly something that could end up, exacerbating the social anxiety once the pandemic ends up passing. And again, continuing more about what I was saying about the inequality of resources in the last section and taking a step back, the outbreak has certainly brought a lot of this inequality to the surface. As I showed you all earlier, communes in Santiago with less resources, which also happen to be poorer per capita, have also been hit harder by COVID-19. And I don't want to get too carried away with this theme and have to climb down from my soapbox, but inequality does not get much more clear than on this chart. You can see that Vitacura's budget per capita is over 7 times the size of Puente Alto's, despite the fact that Puente Alto is a much larger population. And I should mention that Puente Alto, in absolute terms, has the most amount of COVID-19 cases than any commune anywhere in the country. So going forward, I'm sure the inequality to resources, especially healthcare and education, are going to be a key demand for Chileans. And obviously, their government is going to have to do more to satisfy a lot of these social demands. And a lot of resources earmarked in the budget this year to fight COVID-19 are probably here to stay. That's probably fine from a fiscal and debt perspective, because Chile spends less than any other country in the OECD as a percentage of GDP besides Ireland. But there's obviously a balance to strike. And, not to raise too many alarm bells for the clients that we have on the call, but this probably will mean cuts in certain areas that may reduce some opportunities of finding business with the government. But it will most likely mean that there are going to be higher taxes or more taxes in other areas that don't already exist today. And the reason why that's the case is because the government will need to strike the right balance between satisfying its citizens and debt markets. You can see that these are fiscal projections kind of based on consensus forecasts, and things are going to become a lot more negative from a fiscal and debt perspective. Luckily, Chile's debt is already at a pretty sustainable standpoint compared to other countries in the region. But, obviously the amount of spending that the Chilean government is doing this year and next, and that they will need to do in the medium to long term to satisfy some of the longer running social demands, that's not sustainable. There's going to need to be some sort of reshuffling of resources to ensure that there's going to be fiscal equilibrium in the medium to long term, and that the public debt situation does begin to stabilize. Otherwise, the cost of borrowing is going to shoot up from both a sovereign and from a corporate perspective. So with regards to specific items, dealing with the social unrest, the constitutional plebiscite was sort of the hallmark item by the government to try to solve all the country's problems last year. At least that's how they perceived it. Obviously, this is something that would help solve some things, but the reality of the situation is that this is a really long process. Even if we do have the plebiscite in October, and by the way, it may be pushed again if the health crisis has not really been resolved, it's still at least a 2-year process, more likely closer to 3 years. This means that really the government is just kicking the can down the road as it pertains to constitutional uncertainty. And certainly this is the main reason why our forecasts for 2021, 2022, and 2023 are a little bit below consensus, because this is going to cause major business uncertainty and potentially consumer uncertainty if you continue to have violent protests around key constitutional votes. But I've been arguing for a while, for any of you who have heard or seen me present on Chile lately, that this is really it really comes down to lawmaking. The Constitution is important, maybe as a symbolic item, but really what's going to be more important in solving the social crisis is passing laws that really address the unequal elements of the pension reform, pension payouts, I should say, the unequal elements of healthcare and education, and create some medium-sized wins that start to snowball and address many of the social demands that are on the docket, while all the while anticipating political risk. And really, how the government handles this is going to have an impact on the polls. Again, we do have elections in November of 2021, and it's pretty easy to forget that. And it's really way too early to tell. But given the fact that 79% of the people in this poll didn't choose a specific politician in this list, means like elections are going to be a very contentious affair. And surely it's too early to tell, but our base case does call for an anti-establishment candidate to win the election in the December 2021 runoff. In fact, the majority of the people who are listed here would technically fit the definition of anti-establishment, whether or not they're extremists or just relatively inexperienced in politics. Either way, it's going to be something that you should keep on your radar. So the second variable that's extremely important to monitor is extractives. And what we've seen recently in Chile is the country not being able to fully take advantage of the price recovery. You can see that prices have begun to pick up. This is really kind of on the basis of larger economies beginning to reopen, especially China. But copper exports have begun to decline. I should, at least put it as aside that this is still better than most other countries that export copper, especially ones in the region, namely Peru, where we did see export revenues for copper really fall off the chart really over the last 2 months because copper mining was mostly under lockdown as well. In fact, you can see in this chart on the left that mining kind of kept the economy afloat in April and in March because the mines kept up. But that hasn't really changed the entire story. Exports are still declining. We still expect exports to decline. It's made some positive momentum for the Chilean peso to recover a little bit, which is something that's also put into our FX forecasts. But it doesn't really, change the narrative of any sort of major export-led recovery. In fact, I would argue there's probably a ceiling to what copper exports can do for the Chilean economy, mostly because trade volumes are most likely going to decline in major economies probably for the next 12 to 18 months. And you can see all the major forecasts of Chile's main export destinations, and none of them are particularly positive. So really, in sum, the upside for copper exports in our base case is rather limited, despite the fact that the industry is helping keep the economy a little bit more afloat than other economies in Latin America. It is something that's probably saving Chile from an even deeper recession, but it's not going to be returned to the commodity super cycle that we saw at the beginning of the 2000s, where a lot of countries in Latin America grew by above 5% for several years running. So combining all these elements together, this is basically the crux of our forecast for Chile in our economic medium to long-term outlook. The x-axis is like internal factors, which is a lot of the things I was saying in the first part of this section, which is the political environment, constitution, social unrest, and structural damage from COVID-19. And the y-axis is the external factors, which is global market sentiment, which I think is going to be heavily influenced by when and to what extent we have access to a vaccine or a very effective treatment, and copper prices as it pertains to Chile. And you can see that our main assumption is that the external environment will be U-shaped, and that the most likely internal scenario will be challenging internal conditions, which will lead us to a 2023 economic recovery. I should mention that the year referenced in this scenario refers to the year by which the country will reach 2019 real GDP levels. And something that you'll see in the next section is, in particular, this links to Q3 2019 in Chile, due to the fact that Q4 2019 in Chile was one that had the social unrest and an economic decline. So, quick poll question here about some of the things that I've mentioned up until now. Besides COVID-19, what do you believe is the biggest risk in Chile as it pertains to your business through 2021? So it looks like we're having some
interesting results. Alex, how would you answer this question?
I probably would say possible social unrest. I mean, I think that, as I was mentioning, not all the demands that protesters had at the end of last year were addressed, and the healthcare crisis didn't exactly help things. In fact, it probably made things worse. So, it's probably really not really a matter of if things are going to return to the same levels that they were towards the end of 2019, but when. So great. It looks like we have a good amount of answers in. I'm going to go ahead and continue and finish the next part of this presentation in the next 10 minutes to allow some time for questions and answers. And, here's some of the facts and figures that many of you probably care most about with regards to our outlook for Chile. This is really our forecast from our base case scenario you can see that we foresee a decline of 6.1% this year, dragged down by a pretty intense decline of investments and consumer spending. Government spending is going to be the main thing that's going to keep the economy from going into an even deeper recession. And then the 3.8% recovery in 2021 is mostly statistical, as I'm going to show you on the next page. Really, what we're going to be looking at in the medium to long term is growth between 2 to 3%. In the case of 2021, it's going to be below 2% because of the political and constitutional uncertainty that I was alluding to earlier. And you can see if we're at least like looking at this in terms of levels, Chile, we don't expect to make up for lost economic activity this year until 2023, which is still a little bit more optimistic than other countries in Latin America, but it's definitely not the best. And really the main reason why this is the case is because you are going to have some structural growth issues that are going to come after COVID-19 finally finishes. We're probably going to have a lot of bankruptcies. This is going to cause slow employment recovery, lower wages, and overall lower confidence levels. And all this is really going to result in lower potential growth, at least in the short term, that we might have expected before COVID-19. So as far as when we should expect a recovery, this is a question that we get pretty often. We do expect that Chile should start recovering in Q3 2020, so long as most activities do become online. But given the fact that Chile's quarantine, at least in Santiago, was pretty delayed and will probably last for another at least 2 weeks, I would imagine potentially up to another month, you could start having the more full-fledged recovery not take place until Q4. But after that, you start having the positive sugar effect of comparing everything against a really bad Q2 wear away. And we do expect that growth in both our base case upside and our worst case scenario to be more or less flat compared to the previous quarter in 2021. So really that is just measuring against Q2 2019 or 2020, which creates the statistical rebound I was alluding to next year. So that's just our opinion. We're curious about when you expect sales to start picking up in Chile. You can just select one answer here. And again, given the time constraint, I'll probably only spend another 10 to 15 seconds on this polling question. Great, so we're getting some answers in. I would say this is probably a little bit more optimistic than the webinar that I had last week on Peru, but still a lot of people don't really expect a full-fledged recovery until 2021, which is extremely valid. So I'm going to go ahead and continue. This is the scenarios page for the country and what each scenario means for GDP growth and for the average exchange rate for the country. And you can see that even in the more optimistic scenario, it's still going to take Chile another 18 to 24 months to get back to the same level that it was in 2019. The main catalyst for a more optimistic scenario is that you have the spirit of the political agreement from the last stimulus package lasts for the rest of Piñera's administration, more or less, resulting in a lot of key reforms to address social demands get done. In that scenario, you also would probably have a more center-left establishment candidate wins, probably someone from the Nueva Mayoría. But this does have a pretty low probability of only 12%. I do think it's pretty optimistic, to be honest. Our base case scenario, meanwhile, does assume that the country will have slightly less virus containment measures during secondary outbreaks. In other words, dancing the bachata. We do expect that violence would occur in social unrest around key constitutional votes in both the base case and the upside. As far as the Constitution, we expect contentious debates, but mostly changes occurring around the margins. And then finally, as far as the elections go, again, we expect a more anti-establishment candidate to win, maybe someone who's a little bit less extremist, either on the right or on the left, but someone who is pretty new to politics overall. To showcase and to signal that a lot of Chileans are a little bit tired of establishment politics. The worst case scenario does portray a much deeper recession this year and a much less inspiring recovery in the medium to long term. And we do have a little bit of bias to the downside, at least if we're looking at just the probabilities here. This really would entail violent protests lingering even after the pandemic and not just centered around key constitutional votes, lasting until the end of Piñera's administration, including but not limited to his potential resignation, even though at this point I do think it might be a little bit late for that to be a more realistic outcome in this worst case scenario. In the Constitution, we would expect state-heavy rhetoric to prevail and a more extremist presidential candidate to win, again, either on the right or on the left. On the right, that person could be someone like Jose Antonio Cast. On the left, it could be someone who is from the students' protest movements from a couple of years back. Anyone in the Communist Party for Chile could end up winning the election in this scenario, which would cause a lot of business uncertainty, at least in the initial aftermath. So this last section, I'm only going to spend a few minutes on to open the floor to questions and answers. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through the section, but that doesn't obviously reduce its importance. This page here, it has a lot of information. Many of y'all have been forced to reset your priorities. Actually, I should say all of you have been forced to reset your priorities over the last couple of months since the coronavirus started to become a very distinct and concrete reality. And column by column, there are things here that companies are doing right now in these four buckets. There's things at the same time, there are companies that are not doing maybe enough of the long-term actions to help start adapting their company and their strategy to the new normal. I think that's something that's on the right side of the column. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the long-term implications in a minute. But obviously, as far as it pertains to firefighting, and talking about what's probably the most important thing in the left-hand column on this page, which is protecting cash. If we're looking at protecting cash and more specific strategies to protect cash, you can see that some clients are bringing in cash by using new sales channels. A lot of our consumer goods clients have only really been able to use e-commerce as a viable channel over the last couple of weeks and months. We've seen that people try to control personnel costs, cutting non-essential OPEX, trying to restructure loans if possible. From a CapEx perspective, I would say it's probably universal that clients are keeping new CapEx investments on hold and renegotiating contracts for payment terms from CapEx if applicable. And then working capital, which obviously is the most subtle of all of these strategies, this comes down to really trying to reduce DSO, days of sales outstanding with your suppliers and your channel partners, and then retailers, if possible, and prolonging days payable, the amount of time that you take to pay your suppliers and what have you. Obviously, this is a little bit easier said than done, but it's something that our clients have tried to do nevertheless over the last couple of months. So second to last polling question here, which is a question that we've been asking in all of our webinars so far. Where's your company concentrated the most as it pertains to protecting cash so far in Chile? Feel free to choose one. And you can see here that the answer choices range from not foreseeing any cash problems to dealing with either OPEX, CapEx, delaying financial investments or financial payments. Option I is we're doing all of the above as much as we can. And then option J is other. So maybe another 5 to 10 seconds here and see what kinds of results that we get. Reducing and containing OPEX has been the most elected answer probably in all of our webinars up until this point. So these results don't surprise me. So moving on to a couple of opportunities. I've kept the presentation realistic, and it hasn't been the most optimistic story that I could tell, but there are diamonds that still exist in the rough. And looking at some of these issues, accelerating digital transformation, that's something that a lot of clients are doing right now. And luckily, Chile has the existing infrastructure to really make e-commerce and digital customer engagement offline to online and online to offline a very viable option. And of course, being under this situation has accelerated this process. The fact that the Chilean peso has been pretty cheap over the last couple of weeks and months, and the fact that the global environment is risk off could create potentially attractive valuations if you're a little bit more of a risk taker. which could allow you to expand inorganically through M&A in Chile. A lot of clients have tried to push for localization, adapting value proposition to new customer behaviors after the pandemic. And as far as how to play, we've seen a lot of people try to forge non-traditional partnerships to expand market access. One example of this is liquor companies trying to partner with Rappi or other delivery methods if it's legal, or other companies trying to partner with office suppliers or commercial real estate to try to figure out what the new normal looks like in office space, which does relate to the last point that's on this slide. So this will be the last question that I'm going to ask for today. And thank you for your time up until this point. And the question is just, where do you see the biggest opportunity for your company in Chile out of some of the options that I just mentioned, from leveraging lower valuations to adapting value proposition to thinking what the new office space looks like and working culture. There are a lot of things that are very robust and complex of this list that I think that everyone in this call are thinking about. So Matt, given the fact that we're already with only a few minutes left in the presentation, I did want to open the floor to any questions that you've received up until this point that I can try to answer.
Great. Sounds great, Alex. Sure. So first question that we have is, could you please further comment again about the medium-term impacts of the increase in the percent of country debt on GDP?
Great question. So obviously, a lot of the impact on the debt situation is going to be this year, just because the country is going to be issuing a fair amount of debt and has already issued some debt at oversubscribed rates and pretty low yields up until this point. But over the medium term, my expectation would be that the debt situation would become a little bit worse, just because the fiscal deficit is going to continue being pretty large for the next 4 to 5 years. I think that there are opportunities for the Chilean government to try to find other sources of financing, whether it be through multilaterals. I wouldn't totally discount the idea of Chile going to the IMF or the World Bank for more favorable financing, which would lower the amount of debt payments that the country is paying. But overall, we should expect the debt situation to increase a little bit, and I do think it's probably likely that we would see a sovereign rating downgrade sometime this year. That being said, again, like Chile does have a pretty favorable debt situation and debt profile compared to a lot of other countries in Latin America. So I wouldn't get too alarmed by it, but if we start seeing the social demands really start to up the ante on government spending, and a lot of this looks like it's going to be very long-term increases in spending, if we don't see any increases in taxes, then I would become more concerned about the medium to long-term debt potential for Chile.
Great. Yes, sure. I think we have just a few more moments left for the line, just as far as time limit for today goes. So just one other question is, why is the 2021 forecast in the most likely scenario, why is that better than the best scenario as far as in terms of real GDP and percent year over year?
Okay, good question. And I thought that someone might ask me about that. If you're looking at GDP in terms of levels, the amount of economic activity that Chile is going to lose this year is substantially more than it would lose in the upside. So at least really that percentage change is just comparing it to a lower base. And if we're looking at GDP in real local currency units, so Chilean pesos in this case, or if you just want to index it, it's still lower economic activity, at least in terms of actual dollars or pesos, than it would be in the upside. So, again, the upside, I don't think there's a lot of upside as far as it pertains to like really rebounding to pre-COVID levels in 2021. So we have to keep that like somewhat limited. But in terms of the index or looking at it in real currency units, it is lower than the upside. But I do appreciate that question. It's a good question.
Great, sure. Well, I think we're coming up on our time limit for today. So, Alex, do you have any final remarks before we conclude today's webinar?
No, again, I just wanted to thank everyone for their time. If you have any other questions that you had on your mind, feel free to send either Matt or I an email. We'll have this presentation on our portal later today, most likely. And again, if any of you want a debrief or a more personalized presentation or a deeper dive on Chile, don't hesitate to reach out to us or your client services manager.
Great. Yes, thanks. Thank you, everyone, again on the line for joining us. As Alex said, we'll follow up with any responses that we didn't get to today. But yeah, thanks again, everybody, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Great. Goodbye, everyone.